Hi guys, let's start with part 3 of chapter 2, that is the nationalist movement in Indochina. Source B, Declaration of Independence. The declaration of the new republic began by reaffirming the principles of the Declaration of Independence of the United States in 1771 and of the French Revolution in 1791, but added that the French imperialists do not follow these principles, for they have violated our fatherland and oppressed our fellow citizens. They have acted contrary to the ideals of humanity and justice. In the field of politics, they have deprived us of all liberties. They have imposed upon us inhuman laws. They have built more prisons than schools. They have mercilessly slain our patriots. They have drowned our uprisings in rivers of blood. They have fettered public opinion. They have practiced obscurantism against our people. So, what's this obscurantism? Person or ideas that mislead. So, they have practiced obscurantism against our people. For these reasons, we members of the provisional government representing the entire population of Vietnam declare that we shall henceforth have no connection with imperialist France, that we abolish all the privileges which the French have arrogated to themselves on our territory. We solemnly proclaim to the entire world Vietnam has the right to be free and independent, and in fact has become free and independent. Now let's come to 6.1, the new Republic of Vietnam. The new republic faced a number of challenges. The French tried to regain control by using the Emperor Bao Dai as their puppet. Faced with French offensive, the Viet Minh were forced to retreat to the hills. So the French tried to regain control by using the Emperor Bao Dai as their puppet. Faced with the French offensive, the Viet Minh were forced to retreat to the hills. After 8 years of fighting, the French were defeated in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. The supreme French commander of the French armies, General Henry Navarre, had declared confidently in 1953 that they would soon be victorious. But on 7th May 1954, the Viet Minh annihilated and captured more than 16,000 soldiers of the French Expeditionary Corps. So what happened was that on 7th May 1954, the Viet Minh annihilated and captured more than 16,000 soldiers of the French Expeditionary Corps. The entire commanding staff, including a general, 16 colonels, and 1,749 officers, were taken prisoner. In the peace negotiations in Geneva that followed the French defeat, the Vietnamese were persuaded to accept the division of the country. North and South were split. So the North and South were split. Ho Chi Minh and the Communists took power in the north, while Bao Dai's regime was put in power in the south. So what happened was that Ho Chi Minh and the Communists took power in the north, while Bao Dai's regime was put in power in the south. So Ho Chi Minh in the north and Bao Dai in the south. This division set in motion a series of events that turned Vietnam into a battlefield, bringing death and destruction to its people as well as the environment. The Bao Dai regime was soon overthrown by a coup led by No Dinh Diem. So there was a coup led by No Dinh Diem. Diem built a repressive and authoritarian government. So Diem built a repressive and authoritarian government. Anyone who opposed him was called a communist and was jailed and killed. Diem retained Ordinance 10. So Diem retained Ordinance 10, which is a French law that permitted Christianity but outlawed Buddhism. His dictatorial rule came to be opposed by a broad opposition united under the banner of the National Liberation Front (NLF). So he was being opposed under a broad opposition united under the banner of the National Liberation Front. Here's a figure 10. The French commander in Indochina, General Henry Navarre, right. Navarre wanted to attack the Viet Minh even in their remote bases. As a consequence, the French opened many fronts of attack and scattered their forces. Navarre's plans backfired in the northeastern valley of Dien Bien Phu. With the help of the Ho Chi Minh government in the north. Okay, so NLF took the help of Ho Chi Minh. So with the help of Ho Chi Minh government in the north, the NLF fought for the unification of the country. So they want to unify the country. Then here is a box. Box 2. At Dien Bien Phu, the French were outwitted by the Viet Minh forces led by General von Nguyen Giep. The French commander Navarre had not thought of all the problems he would face in the battle. The valley where French garrisons were located was flooded in the monsoon, and the area was covered with bushes, making it difficult to move troops and tanks or trace the Viet Minh anti-aircraft guns hidden in the jungle. From their base in the hills, the Viet Minh surrounded the French garrisons in the valley below, digging trenches and tunnels to move without being detected. Supplies and reinforcements could not reach the besieged French garrison. The wounded French soldiers could not be moved, and the French airstrip became unusable because of continuous artillery fire. Dien Bien Phu became a very important symbol of struggle. It strengthened Viet Minh conviction in their capacity to fight powerful imperial forces through determination and proper strategy. Stories of the battle were retold in villages and cities to inspire people. So here's a figure we have. Figure 11. Supplies being taken to Dien Bien Phu. Viet Minh forces used bicycles and porters to transport supplies. They went through jungles and hidden tracks to escape enemy attacks. Now let's come to box 3. Ho Chi Minh, 1890 to 1969. Little is known about his early life, mostly because Minh chose to downplay his personal background and identify himself with the cause of Vietnam. Probably born as Nguyen Van Thanh in central Vietnam, he studied at French schools that produced leaders such as No Dinh Diem, von Nguyen Giep, and Pham Van Dong. He briefly taught in 1910 and in 1911 learned baking and took a job on a French liner on the Saigon-Marseilles run. Min became an active member of the Comintern, meeting Lenin and other leaders. In May 1941, after 30 years abroad in Europe, Thailand, and China, Min finally returned to Vietnam. In 1943, he took the name Ho Chi Minh, he who enlightens. He became president of the Vietnam Democratic Republic. Ho Chi Minh died on 3rd September 1969. He led the party successfully for over 40 years, struggling to preserve Vietnamese autonomy. So the US watched this alliance with fear, that is, the alliance between the North and the South. Worried about communists gaining power. So the US were worried about communists gaining power. It decided to intervene decisively, sending in troops and arms. 6.2 The entry of the US into the war. US entry into the war marked a new phase that proved costly to the Vietnamese as well as to the Americans. From 1965 to 1972, over 3,403,100 US services personnel served in Vietnam. 7,484 were women. Even though the US had advanced technology and good medical supplies, casualties were high. About 47,244 died in battle and 303,704 were wounded. Of those wounded, 23,014 were listed by the Veterans Administration to be 100% disabled. Here's a figure. Figure 12. American soldiers searching rice fields for Viet Congs. And this phase of struggle with the US was brutal. So the struggle was brutal. Thousands of US troops arrived equipped with heavy weapons and tanks and backed by the most powerful bombers of the time, B-52s. The widespread attacks and use of chemical weapons, napalm, Agent Orange, and phosphorus bombs destroyed many villages and decimated jungles. Civilians died in large numbers. So the struggle was really brutal. US were using heavy weapons, tanks, backed by the most powerful bombers of the time, B-52s. And they were using chemical weapons like napalm, Agent Orange, and phosphorus bombs. And this destroyed many villages and decimated jungles. So civilians died in large numbers. The effect of the war was felt within the US as well. Many were critical of the government for getting involved in a war that they saw as indefensible. When the youth were drafted for the war, the anger spread. Compulsory service in the armed forces, however, could be waived for university graduates. This meant that many of those sent to fight did not belong to the privileged elite, but were minorities and children of working class families. So here is a box 4. Agent Orange, the deadly poison. Agent Orange is a defoliant, a plant killer, so called because it was stored in drums marked with an orange band. So Agent Orange is a defoliant, a plant killer, so called because it was stored in drums marked with an orange band. Between 1961 and 1971, some 11 million gallons of this chemical was sprayed from cargo planes by US forces. Their plan was to destroy forests and fields so that it would be easier to kill if there was no jungle cover for people to hide in. Over 14% of the country's farmland was affected by this poison. Its effect has been staggering, continuing to affect people till today. Dioxin, an element of Agent Orange, is known to cause cancer and brain damage in children, and according to a study is also the cause of the high incidence of deformities found in the sprayed areas. The tonnage of bombs, including chemical arms used during the US intervention, mostly against civilian targets in Vietnam, exceeds that used throughout the Second World War. Okay, so the chemicals or the bombs used, it really exceeds which was used, the chemicals which was used throughout the Second World War. Okay. The effect of the war was felt within the US as well. Many were critical of the government for getting involved in a war that they saw as indefensible. When the youth were drafted for the war, the anger spread. Compulsory service in the armed forces, however, could be waived for university graduates. This meant that many of those sent to fight did not belong to the privileged elite but were minorities and children of working class families. The US media and films played a major role in both supporting as well as criticizing the war. Bollywood, okay, Hollywood made films in support of the war, such as John Wayne's Green Berets, 1968. This has been cited by many as an example of an unthinking propaganda film that was responsible for motivating many young men to die in the war. Other films were more critical as they tried to understand the reasons of this war. Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, 1979, reflected. Okay. Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, 1979, reflected the moral confusion that the war had caused in the US. We have here figure 13. In December 1972, Hanoi was bombed. The war grew out of a fear among US policy planners that the victory of the Ho Chi Minh government would start a domino effect. So it was a fear. So US policy planners feared that the Ho Chi Minh government would start a domino effect. Communist governments would be established in other countries in the area. They underestimated the power of nationalism to move people to action, inspire them to sacrifice their home and family, live under horrific conditions, and fight for independence. They underestimated the power of a small country to fight the most technologically advanced country in the world. So here's a new word, napalm, an organic compound used to thicken gasoline for fire bombs. The mixture burns slowly, and when it comes in contact with surfaces like the human body, it sticks and continues to burn. Developed in the US, it was used in the Second World War. Despite an international outcry, it was used in Vietnam. 6.3 The Ho Chi Minh Trail. The story of the Ho Chi Minh Trail is one way of understanding the nature of the war that the Vietnamese fought against the US. It symbolizes how the Vietnamese used their limited resources to great advantage. The trail, an immense network of footpaths and roads, was used to transport men and materials from the north to the south. The trail was improved from the late 1950s, and from 1967 about 20,000 North Vietnamese troops came south each month on this trail. The trail had support bases and hospitals along the way. In some parts, supplies were transported in trucks, but mostly they were carried by porters, who were mainly women. These porters carried about 25 kilos on their backs or about 70 kilos on their bicycles. Most of the trail was outside Vietnam in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. So, most of the trail was outside Vietnam in neighboring Laos and Cambodia, with branch lines extending into South Vietnam. The US regularly bombed this trail trying to disrupt supplies, but efforts to destroy this important supply line by intensive bombing failed because they were rebuilt very quickly. So, here's a figure. We can see North Vietnam, we can see Laos, we can see Cambodia, and here is South Vietnam. Okay, figure 14, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Notice how the trail moved through Laos and Cambodia. And here's another figure. Figure 15, rebuilding damaged roads. Roads damaged by bombs were quickly rebuilt. Here's another figure. Figure 16, on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Source C. Letters to Mr. Do Sam. Do Sam was a colonel in the North Vietnamese Artillery Regiment. He was part of the Net Offensive started in 1968. Okay, he was part of the TET. He was part of the Tet Offensive started in 1968 to unify North and South Vietnam and win the battle against US. These are extracts from his letters written to his wife from the scene of battle. They show how, in the nationalist imagination, personal love mingles with love for the country and the desire for freedom. Sacrifice appears necessary for happiness. Later dated 6th, 1968. You ask me what you miss most when you think of me. I miss the environment of our wedding. I miss the small cozy room with lots of memories. I miss. Right after our wedding I had to again leave to fight in order to protect the coastal areas of our country. Right after our wedding, I had to again leave to fight in order to protect the coastal areas of our country. What a short time we had before I had to station permanently in the south. The more I think, the more I feel for you. Therefore, I would have to be more determined to protect the country in order to bring happiness for millions of couples like us. Last night, the car kept heading south. This morning, I am writing to you sitting on the stone, surrounded by the sound of streams and the rustle of trees, as if they were celebrating our happiness, looking forward to the day when we can return victoriously. Then we could live in greater happiness, couldn't we? Wish you good health and miss me, Elvis. Letter dated 6/1968. Though you are Elvis in my mind, I have to focus on my work to contribute to the victory of the ongoing struggle of our nation. I have promised myself that only when the South is liberated and peace and happiness return to the people, only then could I be free to focus on building our own happiness. Only then I could be satisfied with our family life. 7. The nation and its heroes. Another way of looking at social movements is to see how they affect different groups in society. Let us see how the roles of women were specified in the anti-imperialist movement in Vietnam and what that tells us about nationalist ideology. 7.1 Women as Rebels. Women in Vietnam traditionally enjoyed greater equality than in China, particularly among the lower classes, but they had only limited freedom to determine their future and played no role in public life. As the nationalist movement grew, the status of women came to be questioned and a new image of womanhood emerged. Writers and political thinkers began idealizing women who rebelled against social norms. In the 1930s, a famous novel by Nat Lin. So, in 1930s, In 1930s, a famous novel by Nat Lin caused a scandal because it showed a woman living a forced marriage and marrying someone of her choice, someone who was involved in nationalist politics. This rebellion against social conventions marked the arrival of the new women in Vietnamese society. 7.2 Heroes of Past Times. Rebel women of the past were similarly celebrated. In 1913, the nationalist Phan Boi Chau wrote a play based on the lives of the Trung sisters. So, he wrote a play based on the life of Trung sisters who had fought against Chinese domination in 39 to 43 CE. In this play, he depicted these sisters as patriots fighting to save the Vietnamese nation from the Chinese. The actual reasons for the revolt are a matter of debate among scholars, but after Phan's play, the Trung sisters came to be idealized and glorified. They were depicted in paintings, plays, and novels as representing the indomitable will and the intense patriotism of the Vietnamese. We are told that they gathered a force of over 30,000, resisted the Chinese for 2 years, and when ultimately defeated, they committed suicide instead of surrendering to the enemy. So we have a figure here. Figure 17, image of True O, worshipped as a sacred figure. So here's an image of True O worshipped as a sacred figure. Rebels who resisted Chinese rule continue to be celebrated. Other women rebels of the past were part of the popular nationalist lore. One of the most venerated was True O. was Drew O, who lived in the 3rd century CE. Orphaned in childhood, she lived with her brother, or on growing up, she left home, went into the jungles, organized a large army, and resisted Chinese rule. Finally, when her army was crushed, she drowned herself. She became a sacred figure, not just a martyr who fought for the honor of the country. Nationalists popularized her image to inspire people to action. So we have a figure here, figure 18, with a gun in one hand. Stories about women showed them eager to join the army. A common description was, "A rosy cheeked woman, here I am fighting side by side with you men. The prison is my school, the sword is my child, the gun is my husband." 7.2, we have women as warriors. In the 1960s, photographs in magazines and journals showed women as brave fighters. There were pictures of women militia shooting down planes. They were portrayed as young, brave, and dedicated. Stories were written to show how happy they felt when they joined the army and could carry a rifle. Some stories spoke of their incredible bravery in single handedly killing the enemy. Nguyen Thi Xuan or Nguyen Thi Xuan for instance, was reputed to have shot down a jet with just 20 bullets. Okay, so some stories spoke of their incredible bravery in single handedly killing the enemy. Nguyen Thi Xuan, for instance, was reputed to have shot down a jet with just 20 bullets. Women were represented not only as warriors but also as workers. So women was represented not only as warriors but also as workers. They were shown with a rifle in one hand and a hammer in the other. Whether young or old, women began to be depicted as selflessly working and fighting to save the country. As casualties in the war increased in 1960s, women were urged to join the struggle in larger numbers. Many women responded and joined the resistance movement. They helped in nursing the wounded, constructing underground rooms and tunnels, and fighting the enemy. Along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, young volunteers kept open 2,195 kilometers of strategic roads and guarded 2,500 key points. They built 6 airstrips, neutralized tens of thousands of bombs, transported tens of thousands of kilograms of cargo, weapons, and food, and shot down 15 planes. Between 1965 and 1975, of the 17,000 youth who worked on the trail, 70 to 80% were women. So 70 to 80% were women. One military historian argues that there were 1.5 million women in the regular army, the militia, the local forces, and professional teams. Here we have a figure 19, Vietnamese women doctors nursing the wounded. So 3.4, Women in Times of Peace. By the 1970s, as peace talks began to get underway and the end of the war seemed near, Women were no longer represented as warriors. Now the image of women as workers begins to predominate. So now the image of women as workers begins to predominate. They are shown working in agricultural cooperatives, factories, and production units rather than as fighters. 8. The end of the war. So we have a figure here, figure 20. North Vietnamese prisoners in South Vietnam being released after the accord. So the prolongation of the war created strong reactions even within the US. So the prolongation of the war created strong reactions even within the US. It was clear that the US had failed. So it was clear that the US had failed to achieve its objectives. The Vietnamese resistance had not been crushed. The support of the Vietnamese people for US action had not been won. In the meantime, thousands of young US soldiers had lost their lives and countless Vietnamese civilians had been killed. This was a war that has been called the First Television War. Battle scenes were shown on the daily news programs. Many became disillusioned with what the US was doing, and writers such as Mary McCarthy and actors like Jane Fonda even visited North Vietnam and praised their heroic defense of the country. The scholar Noam Chomsky called the war the greatest threat to peace, to national self-determination, and to international cooperation. So the scholar Noam Chomsky called the war the greatest threat to peace, to national self-determination, and to international cooperation. The widespread questioning of government policy strengthened moves to negotiate an end to the war. A peace settlement was signed in Paris in January 1974. This ended conflict with the US, but fighting between the Saigon regime and the NLF continued. The NLF occupied the presidential palace in Saigon on 30th April 1975 and unified Vietnam. Here's a figure. Figure 21. Viet Cong soldiers pose triumphantly atop a tank after Saigon is liberated. What does this image tell us about the nature of Vietnamese nationalism? So that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.